Hi there, my name is David. Today, we're not going to be talking about my card game. I want to talk about something a little bit different. Today, I want to talk about power curves across various different TCGs. So, in the context of this discussion, what am I talking about when I say power curve? I am talking about how much power you, as the player, have over the course of turns, over the course of a game, right? So, on turn 1, how much relative power do you have? How much on turn 2, on turn 3, on turn 4? And then comparing these across different trading card games, right? So, this is useful, I think, when thinking about designing a game because you can see where your power curve starts and where your power curve ends. This is very important in the feel and the vibe of the game, right? This is one of the reasons why Magic the Gathering feels so different than a game like Yu-Gi-Oh! Their power curves are very different, right? And also why Pokemon feels a lot different. That game's power curve is also very different. It's also, I think, why a lot of games like Lorcana and Star Wars feel very similar to Magic, because their power curves are very similar. The general overall strength that the player has turn to turn between Magic, Lorcana, and Star Wars is very similar, especially when compared to games like Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pokemon, or Flesh and Blood, that kind of are their own unique power curves in the space of this TCG world that we're in right now. So let's start looking at some graphs. So I made some just rough visual aids. These are not one-to-one. These are not backed by specific stats, but I'll explain them as they pop up. All right, so first graph here today, this is going to be our baseline because Magic the Gathering is the most popular card game in the world, so we're going to be looking at Magic the Gathering. So in Magic the Gathering, one of the biggest things that kind of determines a power curve is what access to resources you have. How many cards can you play in a turn? How many things can you do in a turn, which in a trading card game is often playing cards. For Magic, this is related to how many lands you have. So at the beginning of the game, you have no lands. You can't play any cards. So we're at 0, right? Turn 0, you can do nothing, right? On your opponent's first turn, you can do nothing, right? You have no cards, you have no resources, you're nothing. On turn 1, you get to play a land, right? And then if you have a creature, you could play a 1-drop creature, right? Maybe you don't, so maybe your power level is still basically 0. You still have that land, which is permanent addition to your power. So even no matter what you do, as long as you play a land on turn 1, you are increasing your power permanently for the rest of the game. So let's say you play a creature, right? That creature is going to stay on the board for the rest of the game, unless your opponent interacts with it, or you do some stuff to it, right, to kill it for your own benefit. That creature is going to stay on the board for the rest of the game. So on turn 1, you have a land, which is permanent power, and a creature, which is permanent power. Then on turn 2, you have another land. So you now have 2 lands to add to your permanent power stack, as well as that creature from the previous turn is still on the board, right? So now we have more power than we did on turn 1. And then if you play a 2-drop creature or even 2 1-drop creatures, you are gaining more power than you did last time, assuming that a 2-drop creature is stronger than a 1-drop creature. You had maybe this much power on turn 1 and this much power on turn 2. So together, you have even more power than you did, which is why this curve looks a little bit exponential. Then the same thing follows up on turn 3 and turn 4 and into turn 5. After a round, depending on the Magic format, Commander kind of excluded, but most 1v1 formats, you're not really playing the game out much longer than turn 6 or turn 7, right? And so because of this, a lot of Magic decks have started to kind of cut back a little bit on how many lands are mandatory in their deck, or especially with the rise of double face cards, modal double face cards, allowing some of your lands to be spells. This means that as you get later into the game, you stop playing as many lands, and your power curve, the amount of power that you can add to your curve each turn, starts to level out a little bit. You don't lose power. You very rarely lose lands in Magic. They have kind of made a concerted effort over the recent years to not design land removal, as people just kind of don't vibe with it, basically. And pushing more spell and more utility onto lands increases the power of those land drops as well. So the general flow of a game of Magic the Gathering is you play some lands, you play some creatures, you use those creatures from previous turns on future turns to play stronger cards with your lands coming out as well, and you continue to grow the amount of power that you have. This means that at the end of a game of Magic the Gathering, you are often exploding, right? Generally, especially in Commander, the person who wins the game is the person who did their thing first or the most, right? So when we look at the overall power curve of Magic and the the vibes and the feel of what it means to play a game of Magic the Gathering, you start very weak and you end very strong, right? This is a kind of a power fantasy, is what this kind of rolls into, right? This is a superhero movie. This is most action movies where the hero starts out strong and then they figure out how to get better, and now they're really strong by the end of the movie, right? So this is probably one of the most popular, at least in modern day, stories told by people. So Magic the Gathering's ability to capture that is part of, I believe, a major part of why it is one of the most compelling card games to play in the world, right? And why it has lasted so long from being the first major hit on TCGs and has lasted the whole time, right? Is because of the story that this power curve is telling, right? Starts weak, ends strong. All right, next I want to look at a game of Lorcana. So this power curve looks a little bit different because the resource system for Lorcana is a little bit different. So in Magic, you have to dedicate lands into your deck, and then when you draw them, they don't do anything except for make mana, right? But in Lorcana, almost all of your cards are also lands, right? This is a very familiar system to some of the older Bandai games or Duel Masters, where cards in your hand can be placed face down for resources. This is not 100% of the cards in your deck. Some of the stronger cards can't be turned down as mana or as ink in the Lorcana game. But generally, as long as you are playing the game, and as long as you have cards in hand, you can keep getting more mana, which means you can keep playing stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger cards, which means that realistically, at least over the course of the first 6 or 7 turns, a Lorcana game's power curve just keeps going up, right? Now, these power curves don't take into consideration a bunch of interaction between your opponent. This is generally like if you're goldfishing your hand, obviously, what are we doing, right? As your opponent's interacting with you, you're losing some of those creatures that were permanents on the board that were helping you play out your stronger cards, and so your power curve is going to wane as you're going up this curve, right? But it's basically a wiggle up these curves, right? So in Lorcana, games last a little bit longer than they do in Magic. Magic is even standard is quite a fast format compared to how Magic typically has been in the past. And Lorcana games run a bit longer. They run longer in those turn cycles anyways. There's less explosiveness happening in the early game. And so because there's just less powerful cards because the game's been out for 3 years instead of 25 or whatever. So yeah. The Lorcana power curve is a little bit more exponential, even though the gameplay is simpler, right? Because you can keep playing those lands, you can keep playing those resources down throughout the entire game. All right, next I want to look at Star Wars Unlimited. So Star Wars Unlimited is a little bit different because you have kind of a commander and your leader, and you also start with a resource on the board at the beginning of the game. And then on your first turn, you can choose to place another card from your hand down as a resource. This means that this system is very similar to Lorcana in that every card in your hand can be placed down as a resource, but in this game, it's literally every card in your hand can be placed down as a resource. So that exponential curve just keeps going as long as you want to play higher mana cards. Eventually, you cap out at like 10 or 12 mana, and you just don't need to keep playing more lands, but you may want to double cast some high power cards, so sometimes you'll even go up to 14, 15, 16 lands in some of the late game control decks in a Star Wars deck. But you'll notice that at the 0 turn, our power curve is a little bit higher, because also, Star Wars is a shared turn game, so there isn't really a 0th turn, because both players start the same turn on the same game, right? And at the same time at the beginning of the game. And you start with that extra land on the beginning of the game, so your turn 1 play is a 2-drop, and your turn 2 play is a 3-drop, which is less than doubly powerful as your turn 1 play, right? Whereas with Lorcana and with Magic, if your turn 1 play is a 1-drop, your turn 2 play is a 2-drop, that turn 2 play probably needs to be twice as powerful or a little bit more than twice as powerful as the 1-drop in order to justify playing a 2-drop instead of 2 1-drops, right? Star Wars doesn't have as similar of a problem because they're starting at 2 mana, which means while they do have an exponential curve that actually ends up higher than Lorcana or Magic, because every card in their hand can be mana, that curve takes a little longer to get going because the relative power level between turns is smaller, right? Also, you'll notice this big giant spike in the middle of the graph. This is when a Star Wars leader transforms, right? So most leaders tend to flip into a unit that is on the board that starts readied, so you don't have to wait a turn to use them. Most units in Star Wars enter tapped, which kind of is just like summoning sickness, so you have to wait a turn to use them. But your leader, you do not. The leader enters readied. So most leaders flip on turn 5. This does not take any of your resources. It's just flip. It's just a threshold. You have to be at 5 mana, and your leader can just flip right over. And then your leader can start attacking. So depending on when your leader flips over into their unit, you will get a massive spike in your power level right as you're playing that unit. Most leaders tend to be around 5, which is why I put the spike here on 5, but the interesting about Star Wars is that some control decks will have their leaders flip on turn 6 or turn 7. Some aggro decks will have their leaders flip on turn 4, which means that both players will have distinct different times when they hit this massive spike, and trying to take advantage of that spike if you are the player who's doing it at the timing that you want to be, or trying to minimize your opponent's spike are some of the more important aspects of winning a game of Star Wars, right? This means that on the overall flow of Star Wars, we're still starting weak and ending strong, but there's a little more dynamicness happening in the middle of that area, right? We're not ramping up as fast, though we are ramping up, and to kind of offset maybe some of that boringness that happens from not ramping up as fast, you have this massive spike in the middle of the game that you are trying to manage your spike compared to your opponents, right? So for these reasons, along with some other reasons that have to do with Star Wars, like shared turn system, Star Wars feels incredibly interactive, right? Magic has instant speed, Lorcana doesn't have any instant speed interaction, you can't do anything on your opponent's turn, very similar to Pokemon. And Star Wars, you guys are having the same turn, so kind of everything is instant speed, and you are constantly trying to track when your opponent is about to flip their leader to go to their spike, and when you're trying to get yours. Sometimes you'll delay your spike, sometimes you'll get yours a little earlier, maybe, if you're trying to ramp out. So I think the Star Wars power curve is very, very interesting. Next, let's move on over to Pokemon. So Pokemon TCG is in a very strange place as far as power curves are considered, because typically within the rules of Pokemon, along the resource kind of analysis that we've been going with, the major resource for Pokemon is cards in hand and energy per turn, right? Pokemon is a game that's very similar to Yu-Gi-Oh!, where you draw a ton of cards. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, you're typically tutoring them, but in Pokemon, you draw a ton of cards. In a competitive Pokemon deck, you sometimes will deck yourself out by like turn 5, right? That's if you are not close to paying attention, if you're not paying attention to like exactly how many cards you're drawing, you can easily deck yourself out by turn 5 or turn 6 in a game of Pokemon. You draw so many cards in this game, and some of it is tutoring, but a lot of it is just brutal card drawing. And so you are off to the races way faster in Pokemon. You can play as many Pokemon to your bench as your bench will allow. So you can have up to 5 Pokemon on your bench and 1 Pokemon in your active slot. So you start with a ton of resources immediately, right? And you can deploy almost all of these resources on the first turn, right? You can't evolve your Pokemon on the first turn, and you can't play trainer cards, which are some of the more powerful draw engines on the first turn, if you are going first. If you're going second, and it's your first turn of the game, you can do whatever you want, right? Also, the 1 energy resource attaching to a Pokemon means that you are going to take a little bit to get your attacks off. But once you do, you start taking out your opponent's pieces that have energy attached to them, which is where we get these drop-offs. In a typical game, in a more back-and-forth game of Pokemon, which I'm not necessarily... It's been a while since I played competitive TCG Pokemon, so I can't speak to what the typical current play is, but... in an ideal version of Pokemon, I play my lead Pokemon, I set up my bench, I got all my synergies going, I've got all my card draw, I've got all my trainers, got all my supporter stuff going, and I've got my energy on my Pokemon, and I attack your Pokemon. Eventually, one of our Pokemon is going to die, and when they die, all their energies go to the discard as well, which means that my Pokemon still has all of its energies and still do its big attack that it just used to take out your Pokemon that was fully set up with all of its support. And now you have to bring another one of your Pokemon in that has not had that support already built on it, as we were building up at the same time, and so it's very likely that I am able to blow up the next guy as well, and this creates kind of a death spiral. So you'll notice that this curve actually falls off, right? This curve ends lower than the highest spike on the curve. This is because generally, at least my experience with Pokemon TCG playing it a couple years ago, is that whoever gains control of the board state first typically holds it, right? Because it is so easy to just continually blow up your opponent's stuff before they get the setup that they need in order to be able to fight you back. This isn't exactly one-to-one with every Pokemon game, but a lot of these power curves are just kind of the general vibes of the game as well. This means that Pokemon starts weak and has a high midpoint, but then you end up kind of closing the game out in kind of a semi-lackluster way, right? As the player who would win in this scenario, you just kind of have drawn all your cards. If you play any more cards out of your deck, you might deck yourself out, so you don't want to do that. You have already played all your synergy pieces, all your support pieces, so you're already set up, and now it's just use the attack button to blow up your opponent's guy, and if you do this successfully, you win the game. Which means at the end of Pokemon games tend to feel a little lackluster. But that middle of Pokemon games is where a lot of the juice is happening, right? Where both players are really trying to, you're trying to boss's orders your opponent's Pokemon back up from their back row so that you can hit them before they get set up. So you can throw them off, so you can slow down your opponent's setup turns while allowing your setup turns to still happen, because whoever successfully sets up first often ends up winning the game of Pokemon, because it creates a death spiral where when I kill your piece that can fight me, you lose resources. So it'd be like if I kill your leader in Star Wars, you lose 2 or 3 of your resources, right? Killing your piece that's beating me, I'm incentivized to do anyways because it's beating me. And then also it makes me beat you harder because you lose a bunch of resources, right? So Pokemon has this kind of death spiral, step ladder down power curve that I think is at least interesting to be thinking about. All right, next up we've got Flesh and Blood. So Flesh and Blood is a game from 2019 that managed to survive COVID. So if you haven't played Flesh and Blood, it is genuinely an amazing game. Flesh and Blood is great. It is probably one of my favorite 1v1 games. Flesh and Blood is amazing. But Flesh and Blood starts out completely different than every other game here because the resources are not permanent, mostly, and you start with equipment on the board. So you start with 4 equipment and a weapon, right? Some people start with 2 weapons. And most of the time, the equipment are used, they're expended, they're blown up at some point during the game for amounts of power. Either this is offensive power or defensive power, depending on the equipment, depending on the character, right? But this is a power spike when you use your equipment, right? And then you also have your weapon, which is like a guaranteed way to deal damage to your opponent, no matter what the composition of your hand is, because in Flesh and Blood, you draw typically 4 cards every single turn, and you use cards in your hand, you discard a card in your hand to the bottom of your deck to play the other cards out of your hand. And then at the end of the turn, you draw until you have 4 cards left in your hand again. So this means that most hands in Flesh and Blood are the same, right? As far as where they fit on the power curve, right? If I draw a specific set of 4 cards on the first turn of the game, that will do largely the same amount of damage that they will do on the 7th turn of the game, right? There's nothing specific about those 4 cards that says later in the game do some things. There's some synergy pieces, obviously, that are on specific cards that break this rule, but generally this is the case for Flesh and Blood. The thing that sets us apart is when you want to use your equipment. Because if you have a specific hand that synergizes well with your equipment, or if your equipment has got its timer going and it's ready to do its thing, then you can take advantage of that to have a slightly more explosive hand, typically at the cost of your equipment for the rest of the game. Which is why Flesh and Blood you start out at your most powerful in Flesh and Blood, right? And so you start out really strong, and as you use your equipment, you get little spikes, which is what these little spikes on the curve are. You get little spikes as you are coming down the curve, and you are giving up permanent power for a spike in temporary power whenever you use your equipment, either offensively or defensively, to synergize with the rest of your hand. This is why Flesh and Blood games end up typically feeling like a knockdown, drag-out Coliseum fight, which is exactly the vibes they were going for when they were designing Flesh and Blood. So as far as their power curve, and for the story that they're trying to tell, they have knocked it out of the park completely, right? The final turns in a Flesh and Blood game often feel very tense because you're both very low on resources, and you both know that you are both trying to barely squeak out the edge over the opponent, right? And to see who can close out the game first. So Flesh and Blood has a very unique power curve. It's the exact opposite, arguably, of Magic's power curve, which is why Flesh and Blood does not in any way feel like a Magic clone. Flesh and Blood, I think, probably, especially in this era of like lots of new card games, this kind of card game renaissance that we've been in for the past couple years, Flesh and Blood feels like its own completely distinct thing, completely separated from every other card game that's come before it, because, I think largely because of the story it is telling through its power curve, whereas more similar games to Magic, like Star Wars and Lorcana, I think feel very similar because they have similar power curves. All right, and let's finish it out with Yu-Gi-Oh! This is the power curve for Yu-Gi-Oh! This is just how explosive Yu-Gi-Oh! Is. On turn 0, technically, this is not as true now with some more engine pieces starting your combo as opposed to just being hand traps. But typically on turn 0, you don't really do anything. You don't start with anything on the board like you do in Star Wars. You don't start with an extra resource. You don't start with leaders on board. You don't start with any equipment like you do in Flesh and Blood, right? You don't start with anything on board. You just have your 5 cards in hand, and then your opponent has their 5 cards in hand, and those 5 cards turn into about 15 to 16 to 17 cards. That's just from their main deck, much less their extra deck, which is potentially another 10 to 15 cards that are adding stuff to their deck, to their hand to be used as more resources. The graveyard is often used as a second hand in Yu-Gi-Oh! In some decks, the exile, the banish pile, is used as a second deck, or a second hand. And you just try to wall combo your opponent as fast as possible, right? And then your opponent tries to do the same thing to you, right? This power curve is the power curve of a player who loses in Yu-Gi-Oh!, right? Where you go first and you explode your hand onto the board and you set up a bunch of stuff, and then your opponent draws their 6th card and blows you up back, right? Maybe they hand trap you a little bit so your board is half board, but they just blow you up back, right? And then you end up with nothing on the board and you get exploded because everything has enough attack to kill you in one hit if they do their thing and they break through your board, right? There is old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Games have a little bit more back and forth, but are still quite fast. The older back you go, the more the power curve starts to look like Magic's. but basically, the Yu-Gi-Oh has just shrunk Magic's power curve down to a turn or two, right? And technically, the turn two here, you never even if it's my example of I'm going first, I play my whole hand, and then my opponent goes first, plays their first turn and explodes me and kills me. You don't even really get to turn two, which is why the power curve here is a complete drop off a cliff, right? Yu-Gi-Oh players don't consider a whole round as a turn because it's not granular enough for the conversations that need to be had about Yu-Gi-Oh. If I go first, that is turn one. If you go second on your first turn, that is turn two. So in order to be able to have conversations about Yu-Gi-Oh, because of the speed of the game, because of the power curve that you are engaging with, you need to have different terms than other card games have. How you evaluate cards, generating a value, a 1 for 7, like a Dracotel Fimena is sometimes referred to as, is completely different in the context of Yu-Gi-Oh than it is in the context of Magic the Gathering, because like every card is a 1 for 15 if you go uninterrupted, right? Just because of the amount of searching and the amount of extra summons and extra board presence that you can get in a game of Yu-Gi-Oh. So Yu-Gi-Oh has taken the classic curve of Magic and over the past 25, 30 years really shrunk it down to being the most spiky power curve in any card game that I've played, at least. Alright, so those are the power curves for games that I've got prepared for me today. If you play one of the other games that I have not mentioned that is a part of this TCG Renaissance, and you want to present your own power curve, please feel free to do so in the comments below. You can kind of describe it out, or if you got a little image, you might be able to respond with those. So this is my discussion on power curves. Let me know what you guys think, if you guys agree or disagree with me. And I think that the big thing to take away from this discussion would be that the power curve of a game helps tell the story of that game. For Magic, you start weak, you end strong. For Flesh and Blood, you start strong, you end weak, right? That's why those games feel very different to each other. Pokemon feels like a death spiral. As soon as one player gets ahead, they tend to stay ahead because beating their opponent also punishes their opponent from getting back into the game. And then games like Yu-Gi-Oh just take everything and cram it into one, which is why Flesh and Blood feels so distinct from Magic, which feels so distinct from Pokemon, which feels so distinct from Yu-Gi-Oh. So next time you're playing a card game that you've never played before, or thinking about making your own card game, maybe think about the power curve and the story that your game is telling and how that can set it apart from some of the other contemporary games that are out there right now. So yeah, let me know what you guys think about the discussion in the comments down below, and I will see you guys next video. Peace.